even people who supported the NATO bombing admit that it was illegal. It didn't have explicit UN authorization. The independent commission on Kosovo that investigated afterwards said that it was illegal. So the British Foreign Affairs Committee said that it was illegal. But those bodies nevertheless claimed that it was justified. So the kind of formula that was applied to Kosovo campaign retrospectively was that it was illegal but moral. And I think that the media played a huge role in establishing that alleged morality, that this was maybe technically illegal but the right thing to do. That was the claim, and that claim was made largely on the basis of highly skewed media reporting.
The attack on Yugoslavia, the attack against Yugoslavia by the US and allies and vassals was utterly illegal. The fact is that the United Nations Security Council had the matter of Yugoslavia in its remit, in its orbit, and was engaged fully with it. And the last UN Security Council resolution to deal with the subject of Yugoslavia said that it remained seized of the matter. Well, NATO seized the matter from the United Nations Security Council. In doing so, it flouted not only the UN Charter and absolutely all applicable international law, but even its own Charter, Article 5, which committed it to defending the North Atlantic area and nothing else. So there was in no sense any way in which the legality of that was anything other than illegal. Now, as Phil has mentioned, the morality of the action is being used as the excuse for the illegality of the action. It is in fact has become clear over the period that followed that there was no morality in the act either. And we have the German Foreign Office in March 1999 itself saying there was no ethnic cleansing of Albanians in Kosovo going on. At the time the bombing began, or just before it, there was no ongoing military campaign of any kind going on by the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia armed forces. So there was nothing in the situation to require any kind of intervention. The thrust of all the meetings of the Serbian government at the time was to bring refugees back from the previous anti-KLA, Albanian terrorist campaign of 1998 to their homes. So it's all about normalization, but then NATO moved in.
Part of that kind of moral justification was the claim that it was inevitable. It was a kind of last resort to use force and bombing because they'd exhausted all diplomatic efforts. And there is a kind of surface plausibility to that because there was a long diplomatic process culminating at the Rambouillet talks in Paris. But that's also a good example of the way that sort of distorted media reporting gave the impression of a kind of the morally right choice being made. Whereas in actuality, those talks were deliberately engineered to make sure that the KLA, the ethnic Albanian delegation, signed up to the draft agreement, which was not really an agreement. It was just a kind of Western brokered sort of declaration of what had to happen, that they signed up to it and that the Yugoslav side would refuse it. And the terms of it, initially, in fact, the ethnic Albanian delegation refused to sign. The Yugoslav delegation said, yeah, we could probably sign it if you could just make a few changes. And so they did make changes, but they made changes in such ways to deliberately make it unacceptable to the Yugoslav authorities. and the sort of agreement that no sovereign state would ever sign up to, that gave NATO virtually unlimited access to the whole of Yugoslavia and immunity from international law. Well, now, people like the State Department spokesman James Rubin actually explicitly told journalists at the time that this is what they were doing. He said, we need to make it clear that the Serbs are rejecting this in order that we can then bomb them, right? So it was, and yet in the British media, the truth of what happened at Rambouillet didn't really emerge until after the war had finished. At the time, it was presented as this kind of genuine effort at diplomatic mediation that these, the kind of recalcitrant locals were failing to go along with. So that's a good example. Another good example, I think, is the thing that Marco touched on about atrocities, particularly the massacre at Račak, which, the evidence suggests that it was effectively a kind of firefight between the Yugoslav security forces and the KLA. And that was turned into this kind of mythologized story of a terrible massacre of civilians in the media, a complete distortion of what was going on. And as Marco mentioned, the official reports behind the scenes of the German Foreign Office were saying the main cause of the violence is KLA activities. There is no campaign of ethnic cleansing. It's a counterinsurgency operation. And even the then British Defence Secretary George Robinson even said in Parliament I think it was the day the bombing started, that the main cause of violence in Kosovo to that point was KLA activity. So the truth was there if anyone wanted to go and look for it and find it and report it, but unfortunately journalists decided that they did not want to do that.
The fake massacre at Račak was the reason for Rambouillet, and Rambouillet, the fake peace conference, was the basis for the bombing. So it all went in a line, but the line went even earlier, because even in 1998, you had, for example, papers from the Serbian representative in Brussels. He got hold of the NATO plans for attacking Yugoslavia, which existed in 1998. And he got them such that he was able to warn in March 1999, when the thing was about to happen, and the Serbian army was able to, or the Federal Yugoslav army was able to withdraw forces in response to that information. So this information, the knowledge that NATO was going to bomb, was going to attack Yugoslavia, was well known, and it was a plan which didn't depend on any events just before the bombing began, of which we've agreed there were no events just before the bombing began. So we have a long-standing intent by the US and allies to do what they did. What the ultimate example of that is, before the bombing, you had amazingly, you had Paddy Ashdown turning up illegally into Serbia, into a Kosovo village, to visit the KLA, where they had a huge stash of weapons. And Paddy Ashdown introduced himself to he looked at the weapons. He said, essentially, these weapons aren't much cop. They're not very good. I'm a special emissary or representative, or what it is he said. It's on video, of the Prime Minister Tony Blair, and I've come here to help you kill Serbs. And that was just before the bombing. So this is when this material was shown at the Hague Tribunal, the entire prosecution team, which consisted of British lawyers, went completely silent. I gather, according to the Serbian lawyer that was recounting the episode. But what I'm saying is that this whole thing had nothing to do with morality. It had everything to do with the American perception of what, or the Washington perception of what the US interest was, and getting NATO into line, getting Europe into line via NATO, building a massive, the biggest military base, Bonsteel, in the heart of Europe, in this part of Serbia, not requiring EU permission henceforth to do to be in Europe, not requiring United Nations authorization as required under the UN Charter to engage in acts of aggression, so that the US had a whole raft of interests in establishing its unipolarity through the attack on the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, consisting of Serbia and Montenegro. And this was the reason, the real reason for the aggression against Yugoslavia, and not the moral one that the media were giving us incessantly and without checking. Having worked with the media in the previous episode of the Yugoslav war in Bosnia, and having taken them all around the war zones, interpreted for them and guided them, I got a kind of insight into where they were at. Essentially, these were intelligent graduates who were on their first or second job. They had their they had the line that they were well aware of, and they were looking to follow it and to keep to it, because you didn't want to ruin your career by messing it up and writing stuff about KLA murdering 2,000 people in 1998 before the Yugoslav army crackdown. You didn't want to question whether the KLA had been in fact trained by the BND or the SAS even as early as 1996. If someone told you about those things, you wouldn't really be looking, because why would you? The black hats had already been established in 1995 and earlier. The Serbians had been allocated those hats, and you didn't want to link yourself. It would be embarrassing to link yourself like to a drunken man at a party by taking his point of view. And I think they were really, it was their lives, the journalists' lives, that they cared most about, and they operated in accord with that.
A very important point that Marco makes there is that, in a way, the script was already in place before the bombing campaign started. It had kind of already been written, the script for how the media would report this in the Bosnian conflict, and indeed even before that in the secession of Croatia in the early 90s, where it was already kind of known, in inverted commas, who the kind of goodies and the baddies were in the Balkans. That had already been worked out. And if you look back at the coverage, you can see that immediately, right from the very beginning. In fact, even before the breakup of Yugoslavia began with the secession of Croatia and Slovenia in 1991, even in 1990, you find US politicians and some sympathetic journalists kind of reporting it, and they do it initially through a kind of a Cold War lens, and not surprisingly, because the big story in the region had been the end of the Cold War, the toppling of communist dictatorships, and a lot of, from a Western perspective, the rise of national independence movements in Croatia and Slovenia initially in the beginning of the 1990s looked like, oh, maybe this is something a bit similar to what we've seen elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Maybe this is the kind of coming of Western-style democracy and the fall of communist dictatorship. So it was a kind of misinterpretation from the start. And in that framework, of course, there's only one kind of bad guy. It's the remaining Yugoslav state, and then that is elaborated and sort of embroidered in reporting of Croatia, where it's the kind of westernized Catholic Croats are seen as the sympathetic good guys versus the Eastern Orthodox Balkan Serbs, who are the bad guys. They're the kind of the other. And then you get a similar and even more kind of almost hysterical kind of reworking of this in reporting of the Bosnian War. So by the time you get to the end of the decade, in 1999, everybody knows, as it were, everybody in Western political and media circles knows what the script is. They know who the good guys are. They know who the bad guys are. the other kind of key thing to realize about the period before Kosovo is that another kind of strand of the media reporting had been to establish not just that the Serbs were kind of Eastern Orthodox, Byzantine, Balkan, whatever kind of othering terminology you wanted to use, but also the idea had grown up that they were in some way comparable to the Nazis, which is an extremely kind of, I mean, when you think about it rationally, it's an appalling kind of parallel to draw for a number of reasons. One is it kind of relativizes the actual Holocaust. It's kind of insult really to the to the people whose relatives perished in the Holocaust to say that this local civil war was somehow a replay of that. It's especially insulting in the kind of regional context where hundreds of thousands of Serbs were killed by the fascist collaborationist regime in Croatia and what's now Bosnia. So, you know, it was an appalling thing to say, but they got away with it. They got away with drawing this parallel with the Holocaust with some help from public relations firms hired for that purpose and with a lot of help from the media. The question arises like, why did the media go along with that? And that's perhaps a separate but interesting point we might want to discuss. But nevertheless, that parallel, the kind of Nazification, if you want to use that term, of the Serbs, again was already established prior to the beginning of the Kosovo conflict. And if you look carefully at the reporting, it's sort of obvious if you just pay very close attention to the way that journalists are writing about these claims of genocide in Kosovo that NATO leaders were making. It's kind of obvious that they were quite self-conscious about it a lot of the time. They kind of knew that this was a propaganda offensive, and they will use terms like, you know, carefully calculated parallels with the Holocaust or deliberate propaganda offensive saying that there are parallels with the Holocaust. But then they just kind of join in. So they kind of know that there is a process of demonization going on. They're not naive or stupid about it. They know that's what's happening, but they nevertheless agree that it is justified. And so they then join in rather than questioning. So it's not a kind of, I mean, you might describe it as a lack of curiosity, but I think it's basically what's happening there is that they are essentially on board with the project, and it's very important in the justification of the NATO campaign, because the initial justification, if you remember, the very beginning when they launched the bombing in March 1999. They said, we have to do this because otherwise it's going to be a humanitarian disaster. If NATO doesn't bomb, there'll be hundreds of thousands of refugees. Well, NATO bombed, and then there were hundreds of thousands of refugees. So then they needed a new justification. Clearly, you couldn't say it was a preventative measure. So what were you going to say? Well, then the rationale became, well, there was this premeditated plan for genocide. They even came up, the German government even came up with supposedly these kind of secret documents for Operation Horseshoe, which was the code name for this premeditated plan. It turned out to be a load of rubbish that they'd essentially fabricated.
The Bulgarian intelligence service.
Yeah, they pulled it from the Bulgarian intelligence service. I mean, the whole thing was a nonsense, but it wasn't exposed as a nonsense until, you know, the following year, until 2000. So there was a kind of, I mean, it's a curious thing that if you read those reports with the benefit of hindsight and you read them carefully, it's sort of obvious that journalists were fully aware that there was something a little bit sort of suspect, or at least that there was a kind of deliberate, engineered attempt to present this as somehow a kind of replay of the Nazi Holocaust. But nevertheless, they kind of went along with it and joined in with it and amplified it.
If I could come in here, first of all, yeah, I mean the Nazification of the Serbian public image was trebly or dozenfold terrible, because in fact in the Second World War the first nation that fought against the Nazis that, with no chance of any external help was the Serbian nation. And it was the other ethnicities of Yugoslavia that by and large formed, with the possible exception of the Slovenes, formed Nazi kind of collaborationist units, be they Albanian or Bosnian Muslim or Croat. Those were the that was the reality of the Second World War. But in terms of the reality of the war we're discussing, there was a Guardian and the media presentation of it. There was a Guardian thing not long after that, the 1999 aggression, where they said, where the guy, I think Nick Davies, said that only 12% of stories were checked factually by journalists, and obviously foreign stories get even less checking. And foreign story where there's a demonized party, which is fair game for, you know, we've got the black hat on, we can take aim at it, hasn't got any sponsors to complain on its behalf. Well, that one isn't going to get checked at all. I mean, Martin Bell, when he was asked years later, had he any advice to give to young journalists, he said, don't believe atrocity stories, which is fair enough. Will Hutton, who was editor of The Observer at the time, I saw him just after the bombing at a peace conference here in Taplow. I was asked about Rambouillet and the significance of that in fomenting the bombing, as it were. And he said, basically, we didn't have any knowledge of that. We didn't know about it. We didn't know to look, and we weren't competent to look. And that was him talking about the world of journalism, not me, though I would hugely agree with it. You had, I mean, in the Bosnian conflict, fake news had been a weapon of war, and Kosovo was just a more sophisticated continuation. You've got a guy called, at Yale University, Samuel Moyne, who's a leading contemporary historian, who said that he worked at the White House as an intern, planting stories in the Washington Post that served the US purpose to foment war. And he said, that, you know, that at that time, journalists, unlike the Vietnamese period journalists, the Bosnia and Kosovo period journalists weren't interested in investigating, as I've said, any further. And in fact, things were even worse. You had in CNN in Atlanta, you had members of the 4th Psychological Operation Group, Psychological Operations Group of the US Army were in CNN at the time of the bombing, obviously influencing them in their presentation. And one of the things that really stuck in my craw about that presentation, I mean, there was so much, there was so many, the blood, the gore, the lies, and the impossible to establish claims. But one of the systematic ones, which just begs the question why they're doing it, is that the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, once it was under attack by the US, was not the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia or Yugoslavia or even Serbia and Montenegro or even Serbia. It was the Serbs. The Serbs, those sounding like some primitive tribe which basically has no particular defined border, is not the subject of 10,000 agreements in international law, and has existed for aeons, as it were. It's like the whole thrust was that this is not a legitimate country, therefore we Johnny Foreigner can bomb it and bomb happily away and teach the Serbs a lesson. And the Serbs were only replaced with the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia when they'd finally when the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia's leadership had finally surrendered in at the start of June. And then suddenly you got the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia has agreed to do X, Y, and Z. But for the period when they were being pasted, they were the Serbs. They weren't a country, they weren't legitimate, they were totally demonized and given a status equivalent to the Jews in a Nazi concentration camp.
There's various reasons you might point to for the kind of poor performance of the media. One set of reasons you could say are kind of generally applicable in wartime, that there is a kind of a kind of heightened subservience to official sources when your country is involved in a conflict. There is a kind of you could maybe talk about kind of laziness, inexperience, lack of fact checking, that kind of thing, which are kind of, they're not unusual kind of professional failings that happen from time to time in journalism, and especially I think tend to be more serious when reporting a war. And you can look at other wars, look at the 2003 Iraq war and the failure to ask questions about the weapons of mass destruction that were supposedly the justification for the whole thing. So it's not, there's a kind of general reason, but I think there is a very particular peculiar reason in relation to the former Yugoslavia reporting of Bosnia as well as the Kosovo conflicts. And that's the kind of role that journalists started to see for themselves in that era in the 90s, the kind of post-Cold War era. And in a way, there's a kind of parallel, I think, between the way that journalists start to understand their role and the way that you can look at the Kosovo conflict itself as being, and Marco alluded to this earlier, the way that it was very kind of important to the West's own self-image. I mean, during the Kosovo conflict, you had the 50th anniversary of NATO, and the campaign that it was engaged in at the time was, in a way, the kind of perfect peg on which to hang an idea of its new post-Cold War mission. What was the point of NATO? It was no longer kind of defensive Cold War era organization. So what was it? Now it was an organization that was designed to kind of project these alleged values, cosmopolitan, humanitarian values of upholding peace and democracy and human rights, through the military power of NATO. So there's a kind of, and that's, I think, the kind of justification, particularly from the other side of the Atlantic, the idea of NATO engagement in the world in a kind of cosmopolitan way. That also gets a particular European spin. So various, the then Secretary General of NATO, Javier Solana, and also the British Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, at the time, both made a big play of talking about the NATO intervention as the new Europe. There are two Europes. There's the old, bad nationalist Europe, and then there's the new human rights-centered cosmopolitan Europe that we stand for. So it had a kind of local European dimension to it too. And that, that sense of Europe, of NATO, of the West in general, and different NATO countries and governments getting a renewed sense of purpose and mission from military interventions such as the Kosovo campaign, I think has been really important. It's had a long-lasting effect. And I think that something quite similar also plays out in the media, that you get in the 1990s. I mean, Marco mentioned Martin Bell, a BBC journalist, who is a prime example of this, I think, and he coined this term, the journalism attachment, specifically to describe it. The idea that journalists could take on a kind of mission of influencing government policy by whipping up public opinion and public sympathy for a particular interventionist policy, if they took sides rather than reporting in a kind of objective or neutral fashion or trying to do that. Instead, if they were to take sides, then that would be the kind of morally correct thing to do. And so there's a kind of, I think, very close parallel between the way that NATO governments start to think of, well, what is our kind of moral mission, or at least how do we explain publicly what our moral mission is in the post-Cold War era, and the way that journalists also start to think, what is our role? We're no longer satisfied with just being these kind of neutral reporters seeking truth. We're instead we're trying to kind of promote a particular cause and be on the side of good versus evil. And once you have that mentality, there's a kind of obvious temptation, and reporters succumb to it time and time again, in reporting Bosnia and then in reporting Kosovo, to make the facts fit that framework. So if something doesn't really fit, well, maybe we won't report it, or we'll knock it down the news agenda so most people won't notice it. If things do fit, then we'll give them a headline coverage. And if we can't find anything that fits, then yeah, maybe we could even kind of help to embroider some stories that we'll take at face value, propaganda claims made by NATO spokesmen, because they fit the narrative. So it's not just a kind of, I mean, I think it's worse than a kind of dereliction of professional duty that you could sort of routinely see happening from time to time in the reporting of different areas, and especially in wartime. It's worse than that in the sense that journalists have, in the 90s, you can see that them deliberately kind of taking on this role. And to my mind, it's essentially a propaganda role. I mean, during the Kosovo conflict, NATO, as you know, bombed Serbian broadcasting, including the TV building in central Belgrade, and justified the bombing, which killed civilians. They justified it on the grounds that this was a propaganda organization. It was part, therefore, of the military machine. Well, if that's true, well, the same is also true of the BBC or ITN or Sky News or any of these news or CNN, any of these Western news organizations, which started to take on that idea that their role was to promote, as they claim to see it, the role of good versus evil in the post-Cold War world.
They were looking for the authority to act outside the aegis of the United Nations Security Council. So when they gave themselves the right to engage in so-called humanitarian interventions, which were neither humanitarian nor interventions, they were involvement, they were active plans to target a country. When they gave themselves the right to do that, they were making sure that they didn't have to ask, in that sense, the United Nations for authority. They were trying to bypass the United Nations, and they've been doing so ever since, with all this talk of a rules-based international order, responsibilities to protect as well. I mean, they are simply giving themselves powers that they want to have in order to further concrete ambitions of a geopolitical nature. I'm talking here primarily about Washington, but obviously in these operations, following the fiasco that was the aggression against Yugoslavia, it's probably difficult to get, and it'd probably be impossible to get all of NATO to join in again. So what you have now is coalitions of the willing, consisting of those countries which feel there's an interest on their part in engaging in such an operation. So the attack on Yugoslavia has created the precedent which has established the basis by which they bomb and attack countries in the Middle East ad infinitum. So we have Libya being attacked by Cameron and Sarkozy after a short while after Gaddafi declared that he wouldn't be taking euros anymore as well as dollars. Suddenly the makers of those currencies attack him about a year and a half later, as happened to Saddam Hussein when he abandoned the dollar before that. So you get the interested parties basically put on their humanitarian hat and start killing people, and their domestic populations carry on discussing gender differences and getting excised about those, while they simply accept the mass murder that's going on in their name in these countries. And that's the reality. So we have Tony Blair, who's calling Milosevic an indicted war criminal in order to bolster his case that Blair is acting morally. Well, he's clearly an unindicted war criminal, that is to say Blair, because while Milosevic was found innocent by the Hague of events in Bosnia, and they didn't even try to really pin anything after the initial publicity regarding Kosovo, we have Blair continues his wicked way, using the media immunity that got him the nickname Mr. Teflon as far as the aggression against Yugoslavia was concerned. He then implements it in Iraq, where we have probably going for 1 million casualties of that war that he launched with Bush against those Muslims in that country. And that we then have David Cameron, not to be outdone by his idol and hero and predecessor guru, Tony Blair, decides to do the same thing to Libya. So in essence, the imperialist age is back, but in an infinitely worse form, because we've got the weaponry in the powerful, rich Western countries to do far more damage than the Palmerstons of the world ever did. And we have politicians at the top of the Western tree being very happy to use those weapons, very happy to engage in those operations, which make them appear strong leaders, usually domestically. That's the plan and the purpose anyway, or one of them. And luckily for the world, Blair was exposed in Iraq. Perhaps Cameron has been very lucky as far as Libya is concerned. But there you are. That's the reality. That's all. So 1 million deaths and rising, all deriving from the world accepting the attack on Yugoslavia as having some kind of legitimacy. It wasn't humanitarian. It wasn't an intervention. It was an attack, and it was designed to further geopolitical aims, and as have all the subsequent attacks on other countries since.
Just to say, I really agree with that, and it reminds me of it's an international relations scholar, Philip Cunliffe, who wrote a book called Cosmopolitan Dystopia, the title of which I think describes very well the kind of the legacy in terms of foreign policy of of the Kosovo War. It's still held up even today as a kind of model of a successful humanitarian intervention. But as Marco says, I totally agree that in many ways it's even worse than the kind of old style imperialism. Old style imperialism, which was about not that it sometimes claimed a civilizing mission, but it clearly was about conquering territory and holding it and that kind of thing. Today's values-led humanitarian version of imperialism is even worse. It has no clear direction, no clear endpoint. There's no kind of limit to the violence that can be done in its name. I also wanted to come back on the point, sort of related to what Marco was saying about the ICTY, the Hague Tribunal, which another important moment in the establishment of this idea that there was the Kosovo War was possibly illegal but nevertheless moral, was the way that they essentially got the indictment of Milosevic by the ICTY while the bombing was going on. I mean, it was so kind of blatantly, obviously an attempt to lend a kind of veneer of legitimacy to what NATO was doing. I think it even kind of risked backfiring by being a bit too obvious and blatant. But nevertheless, the ICTY has been the Hague and the kind of the mechanisms of international law, or the rules-based order, as it's often. These things have been very important, I think, in establishing this kind of one-sided legitimacy of who's allowed to take military action and who's allowed to defend themselves and who's allowed to pursue their interests under cover of moral rhetoric. And that too, I think, that the kind of legalistic ICTY version of a kind of moral justification for Kosovo, that too, in a way, has a kind of lasting legacy. There's been various attempts since in the many years now since the Kosovo War to keep using ICTY indictments to kind of put moral and diplomatic pressure on Serbia, to get the Serbian government to do what the West wants, and also to make the West look good. So that, they've passed resolutions about for instance, about Srebrenica. They wanted to have a UN resolution about it. The British proposed it in 2015, making it illegal to dispute the, to my mind, propagandistic characterization of Srebrenica as genocide. That failed because Russia vetoed it, but the European Parliament did pass such a resolution. And if you look even today, when the EU, writes its kind of annual reports on Serbia and Serbia's progress towards EU membership, it brings it up. It brings up events from the mid 1990s and tries to discipline what people in Serbia are allowed to say about it.
And that is partly the fault of the Serbian authority. The Serbian government is utterly passive on these questions. It feels that as it's beholden to the New World Order Sultan, it then pipe up and state the opposite case. For example, they are literally afraid of saying, even in their conversations with the British Foreign Office, this came up a couple of years ago, that they didn't dare say, well, actually, the International Court of Justice found Serbia innocent of involvement in the events of Srebrenica. And when the ambassador finally piped up to say so, his interlocutor at the Foreign Office said, well, why didn't you say that earlier? Well, the answer is they're too intimidated to say it earlier, and they've been not fighting the war for their own image and for the image of their predecessors for a period of decades. But the truth about Kosovo and the events there, you can see, I mean, the presentation of the aggression against Yugoslavia in 1999 was that it was done because the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was supposedly fighting against innocents. But if you look in the official Serbian White Book of the time, it provides hundreds of documents, of pictures, of gory, sad examples, names, identities, ID cards, everything, passports of the KLA's multitude of murders in that 1998 period, including of Albanians, loyal or rather normal Albanians who wanted to get on in the state that they were living in, and Roma, you name it, they were being killed by the KLA. Even if they spoke good Serbian, they'd be killed by the KLA. So when you add to that the organ harvesting that was going on at the time as well by the KLA leadership, you see exactly what the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia or Serbia was fighting against. And the entire moral basis of the NATO operation disappears. The basis on which to take Kosovo away from the rest of Serbia disappears. And the Americans are perfectly aware that the moral basis of their action in 1999 has disappeared. But the consequences remain. Serbia is still partitioned. Billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of damage in today's currency were caused to Serbia on the basis of a false premise of Serbian culpability. Nobody has paid Serbia compensation for this. That country has been destroyed back to the Stone Age, and the people who did it have walked away, as they walked away from Iraq, as they walked away from Libya, as they're walking away from Syria. And words really fail me about the basis of Western society when I look at the reality that I'm discussing.
You know, you can talk about the kind of long-term consequences in the way that kind of Kosovo, NATO's Kosovo campaign gave the kind of green light or a stamp of moral approval to types of foreign policy which we've seen enacted in many other places since 1999. That it's a kind of longer term trend, and I think it's also right to draw attention to the longer term regional consequences as well. And it may be worth noting here that within a few weeks, less than a month after coming to office, President Joe Biden wrote a letter to the Serbian government. I mean, Joe Biden, incidentally, virulently anti-Serb views, I mean borderline racist views of Serbs that he voiced throughout the 90s, very kind of gung-ho military interventionist in that era. Now he's president, and what does he do immediately on taking office, virtually, he writes to the Serbian government saying, well, you've got to recognize Kosovo as an independent country. So the Serbian government is being asked to, and the EU putting pressure on them to do exactly the same thing. The Serbian government is effectively being told, forget about your citizens in Kosovo, the bits that you still have some control over. Forget about the integrity of your nation state. Forget about, you know, having sovereignty over your national territory. Forget even about changing those things through any kind of democratic process. You will do what the United States government and the EU tell you to do. So there was a kind of long-term legacy of this and of the Kosovo War in terms of the way that international, effectively Western power is still exerted over Serbia, you know, in relation to Kosovo, and often using the kind of moral blackmail of the Balkan Wars and the particular version of them that's been established in the Western media as justification for that. So, you know, I mean, people in Serbia who I speak to, I know many of, especially younger people, would rather kind of forget about it all. You know, it's like the bad old days, and we want to look forward. But the world won't let you forget about it. The world won't let you just put that behind you and move on, because it's still used as a kind of stick to beat Serbia with, and it's still used as a way to kind of effectively interfere in Serbia's domestic politics and tell it how to conduct itself.
Following the NATO entry into Kosovo, there was an enormous amount of NATO of ethnic cleansing on NATO's watch of all the non-Albanian communities, and this was presented by NATO spin doctors as natural revenge cleansing, as it were. Well, in fact, the entire Roma community, the Gypsy community, were ethnically cleansed along with their fellow Serbian citizens, and so the excuse given by the ethnic cleansers of the KLAers, was that these people were collaborators. But actually, what they were, when by collaborators, they were meant normal contacts between the state and its citizens. If you had normal contacts with the country you lived in, you were viewed as a collaborator worthy of ethnic cleansing or death to the KLA who led Kosovo after NATO supposedly took the place into its protection. There was no protection offered by NATO to anybody in its control of Kosovo. People were murdered, their killers applauded, literally in public. Investigations were not taken. It's NATO's passivity in the face of real ethnic cleansing on its watch, when it had come in ostensibly to protect against such things, is another scandal which hasn't been aired and which deserves to be aired. The other thing I would say is that we have what did the ripping away of Serbia's Kosovo heartland do for that heartland? It converted it into a den of heroin smuggling, systematic slavery and enslavement of women from all over Europe, of human organ trafficking, of drug running on NATO's watch, in NATO's presence. That's what the NATO operation succeeded in doing. And if that isn't a moral question, then I don't know what is.